Hello, everybody. My name is Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education, and welcome to our webinar today. The title of this session is Reimagining Teaching, Diversifying the Educator Workforce and Beyond. I think many of you know this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. This is also a topic that when we did our big vision for the next stage of education philanthropy survey earlier this winter, we saw real interest in the topic of racial equity and beyond that, diversifying the teacher workforce as a key strategy that many of our members think is going to be really important on our pursuit of racial justice. So we have a really great panel here today. I want to introduce them and put the slide up that shows their name and affiliation. We've got in Melinda Wright from the Walton Family Foundation, our facilitator for the day. We also have Heather Kirkpatrick from the Alder Graduate School of Education. Also, Elisa Villanueva Beard from Teach for America, and Jesse Solomon from the Boston Plan for Excellence. What I'm going to do now is turn things over to our fine panelists to kind of introduce themselves. And I'd really like them to say a little bit about their organization. And then also, you know, the world has changed a ton over this past 16 months or so of COVID. The way we think about education and educating students has changed. And we know now lots of dollars are flowing into the public school system. So we'd really like you to share kind of what's your organization doing and what's top of mind as you think about the future. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Melinda, and I may reserve the right to pop back in and make sure that I feed questions from the chat, and we're going to welcome you in the audience to throw in questions from the chat anytime. All right, with that, Melinda, take it away.
Thank you so much, Celine. I'm so excited to be here today, especially with this esteemed group of panelists. And I'm just going to add maybe a minute of context because like Celine, I'm super excited for this conversation and really interested in this topic. But as Celine mentioned, diversifying the educator workforce is a top priority for so many education and philanthropic leaders. And given that, we're asking ourselves questions like, what are the strategies to make this systemic change? Who are the innovators who are moving the needle to make it happen? And how can funders serve as a catalyst? So given that you all were here from this amazing group of panelists, we'll dive into conversation. We'll certainly leave time for questions at the end. And the only thing I would add is definitely use the chat function. I think many of us have found in virtual forums that sharing your thoughts, your ideas, your amens and ashes in the chat, keep it fun and exciting for everyone. So please do so. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather to introduce herself first. Thanks so much.
So I'm Heather Kirkpatrick. I founded Alder Graduate School of Education. There's a number of ways you could decide how we were founded. We started the pilot in 2010, incorporated in 2015 after a 5-year pilot. The data was really extraordinarily promising, and that's what led us to incorporate as a separate nonprofit from where we started the pilot. And in 2020, we earned independence as a grad school of ed, granting master's degrees and credentials, just like other grad schools of ed around the country. We started with a class of 20 in 2010 when we were piloting, and we just graduated almost 200 students on Saturday, so about almost 700 to date. We have 250 students starting just in about a week. Really excited. A lot of us got into this work in part because we believe that one of the problems in how public schools run and work is the lack of community that's possible when there's retention, teachers really staying and creating that community. And so excited to share about 61% of our students are still teaching, and we hold ourselves to teaching in the place where they were trained. It's a residency model and a sort of an apprenticeship approach if you aren't familiar with residencies. And so 61% are still in the school systems where they were trained. And that compares to apples, to 42% of teachers who came in the same year they did as new teachers who are still there. About 75% of our students are teachers of color. So to the topic today, really excited about that and happy to think with if people are interested in how that works. 70% are first-gen college grads, about 45% are Pels, so that of course is sort of a proxy for class. And then you'll see, I think all three of us are sharing hard to fill areas, so science, math, so STEM, about 15% at Alder, and about 20% are special ed. It's another really hard to fill area in the teacher prep world. And interestingly, at Alder, the average age is 28. So we do get some students right out of undergrad, but the vast majority of our students are people who are from the community. They've been paras and instructional aides. They've worked in the nonprofits in the communities where the public schools are that we serve. So average age is a little older than you might expect. 90% of our students complete, and 96% are hired in the systems where they're trained as apprentices or residents. And then excitingly, I think it was just last summer, I started to realize that one of the things we were really doing because of how we recruit and have been so intentional about recruiting for diversity and recruiting in the communities where the public schools are, where we partner, I looked into this, and turns out 70% of our residents come in earning 30K or less when they start with us. And starting teacher salaries in California are 50K. And while that's a terribly low number, I'm sure it sounds that way to you, and it feels that way to me and them too, that 50K is a significant leap, right? If you've been earning 30K or less up until then. So really excited about this. It was very clear to us in the very beginning, this will be my last sentence, very clear in the beginning that we were producing excellent teachers. Happy to talk about those metrics as well later. What wasn't so clear was this really, what's now clear is this community-based workforce development pathway that I think is so pertinent to the conversation today.
Thank you so much, Heather. We can turn it over to Jesse Solomon next.
Great. Thanks, Melinda. I would say it's great to see everyone, but I can only see the other panelists, so that would be a lie if I said it's great to see everyone, but it's good to know you're out there. Boston Teacher Residency is a teacher prep program. We were founded in and by the Boston Public Schools a long time ago, 2002, and we came out of the idea at that time that while there were a number of institutions of higher ed in the city or right around the city, the superintendent at the time, Tom Pezant, really felt like he was having trouble getting the teachers he wanted, teachers who were committed to Boston, who were prepared in and for Boston's instructional agenda, who reflected the demographics of the student body. And so we decided to do it ourselves. And so we're 18, 19 years old. We've helped start a national organization called the National Center for Teacher Residencies, which supports the growth of residencies all across the country. And we have, I think, a lot in common with what Heather talked about. Right now, our overall 3-year retention rate is about 70%. And again, that only counts teachers who stay and teach in Boston. We don't, if someone goes to New York or Chicago, we track that, but we don't count that for our own retention rate. We set a pretty arbitrary number at the beginning that we would always have 50% folks of color in our programs, and have pretty consistently been at that mark. We have focused a lot on supporting teachers to enter STEM fields, special education, ESL, basically the hard to fill areas. Our program has probably gone the opposite of most programs. We've gotten significantly smaller in the last couple of years. The reason we did that is we really felt like the teacher preparation work we did was critical and a core part of our strategy, but we also knew we wanted to cross a number of fields. So we've started running our own schools and preparing teachers in those schools. We work very closely in one neighborhood in Boston. We work with a set of community organizations across a set of fields, and much more of a kind of place-based strategy. And so very similar to what Heather was talking about, a lot of the folks that we recruit are from the neighborhood, from the city. They commit to stay in the neighborhood in the city. And we really are trying to think about outcomes more broadly. And maybe the last thing I'll say is, this has been one of the nice things about running schools at the same time, is, we really think a lot about, racial wealth gaps and how we can contribute to closing racial wealth gaps. And so that is an element in our schools, that's an element in our teacher prep program, and we see a number of those efforts coming together. So hopefully we'll talk more about that today, but it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Thank you, Jesse. And last but not least, a longtime colleague and friend, Elisa Villanueva Beard.
Thank you, Melinda. Thanks for hosting us, Celine, and facilitating the conversation, Melinda. Great to be here with Jesse and Heather. My name's Elisa Villanueva Beard, and I'm our CEO here at Teach for America. And I'm just really glad we're having this critical conversation today because the future of our country depends on it. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Teach for America, I'll give you the cliff notes here. Teach for America was founded in 1989, and we were responding to the problem of educational inequity in our country. And we know that where you happen to be born largely dictates your life outcomes and opportunities, and we reject that, as does everyone on this call. And we are working to address the outmoded and inequitable system that our kids face and are a part of every day. And our contribution to that problem is leadership. For over 30 years now, we've been providing transformative leadership to the field of education. Our folks, we go after, young people, mostly from recent college graduates who have all backgrounds, all, interests, and we get them to teach for at least 2 years. And they have become lifelong advocates and are pursuing change, fundamental change of the education system over a lifetime is what we've seen. We now have a network that is 65,000 strong. It includes our core members and alumni who are working in classrooms, who are working as school principals, system leaders, CEOs, social entrepreneurs. They are also organizers and public officials. Our core members and our alumni are working across 9,000 schools in urban and rural America. We are serving 37 states and Washington, D.C. And as you can see on the slide, over the last 7 years, our incoming core has been at least 50% people of color and about a third first-generation college graduates. And what this enables too is the diversification of just the pipeline of educators at all levels of the system. So as our folks go on to be principals and system leaders, as you all may know, in our country today, as you look at all principals, about 19% are people of color. When you look at our alumni, our 1,500 alumni who are school principals, about 37% are people of color. When you look at superintendents, 6% are people of color across the country. When you look at our set of 500 superintendents, we have 33% are people of color. So it's helping to diversify the entire education workforce. And I joined Teach for America in 1998. Like many of other alums, I was headed to be a lawyer. I thought this would be 2 years, but as it turns out, it was never about 2 years. And I have been working with the organization in various roles ever since that. And what we find with our alums, 4 and 5, our alumni have committed their lives to working in education or have a career serving a low-income community. I've been privileged to work, with the organization over time. And the last thing I'll say is, while my work as a CEO has been a great privilege, and I've been in this role for now 6 years, I live in Houston, and I have the privilege of raising 4 sons with my great husband, Jeremy. I'm looking forward to the discussion today. And I'll say that over the last 23 years, I've never felt like this work matters more. And the engagement of our community has never mattered more as we think about the future of education for our children.
Thanks, Elisa, and thanks to all of you for your introductions. And I think we'll go ahead and dive right in. One thing that's coming to mind, listening to you all, there's so much to be hopeful for. And yet the reality is that so many of our practitioners are tired and at capacity. What are your thoughts on how philanthropy can be supportive and responsive at this moment, especially when we think about diversifying the educator workforce? And Jeff.
Did you say me? Sorry, their computer froze. I think so. Yeah. So it's a great question, a central question. I was just walking around our schools this morning, and everybody's telling me how tired they are. I think, yeah. So I think that the teaching job as it's currently constructed is near impossible. It's been many years since I was a high school math teacher, so I'm far away from it. But I run an art club, and I try to help out a little bit on Zoom, or even just help out, like, in the school in the morning. And as many of you on the call probably have experienced and know, like, the pace of the day, the number of things you're asked to deal with feels like it only grows. And we're an industry, an enterprise, if you will, that like only adds, right? We don't ever think about getting better by subtracting. We think about getting better by adding. And so my sense is the number of things on a teacher's plate trying to run one good 45 minutes of instruction is massive. But then to do that, and as everybody knows, to be a social worker and to connect with families and to deal with the 17 pieces of paper that you're supposed to fill out, that's insane, right? And so I think the question for us as a field is, could we think a little differently about what teachers are supposed to do all day long? And my sense is that a role for philanthropy could be in the kind of R&D space there to think about some models that think of, they don't need to be prohibitively expensive, but use money smartly to think about taking some of those things off teachers' plate. This is, years old, right? But just the number of hours of planning time that a teacher in Japan has versus a teacher in the US and those kinds of things. So we could play around with some models, and with the idea that potentially we could disseminate those if we were able to find some sustainable models that work for teachers.
Thanks for that, Jesse. Heather, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would build on what Jesse shared. When I think about the role of philanthropy, I think there's really two tracks. So Jesse talked about R&D, and I think that can be so powerful. Obviously, with philanthropic dollars, I'm sure the audience has read a lot about this. I think this has been even more elevated as one avenue for philanthropy to make things possible that wouldn't be possible without it. So absolutely. And when I think, if we run with Jesse's, one of the ideas, there's a million things you could do around R&D, right? But let's take Jesse's. Let's run with the idea of creating opportunities to pilot more time for teacher planning, which I think is beautiful and certainly something that we see in other countries that we hold up as at the top of what public education could be. If we think about that, it brings me to the second thing that I think I wish philanthropy, and some do, maybe lots of this audience, but it really is the idea of staying the course. And I think one of the things that exhausts teachers and that exhausts anyone in any nonprofit education space or otherwise is the uncertainty. We saw that this year. I think a lot of the exhaustion is just the whiplash, and we're constantly riding waves. We're constantly trying to read tea leaves, and that's hard. And so I feel like R&D is beautiful and critical, and yes to that for philanthropy, and for the philanthropists who have the appetite and really feel like, you've found your cause, you know what you care about. It's staying the course and being in it with the nonprofit organization or whoever it is you're investing in, so that you can help even out those waves that get created by the R&D, shiny new things that happen. And so if I think about the piloting of what would it mean for this country to invest in teacher planning time, that's going to take years of work. It's an incredibly political conversation. It's going to take a remarkable number of economists and people in DC and others and or state capitals. So my brief answer would be yes to R&D, and then the other one is really thinking about committing for the long haul.
Yeah, that's really resonant. Thanks for that. Elisa.
Well, I'll start off by saying, the obvious, which is this is a defining moment for this generation of students and for our country. We've seen a 100-year disruption in our education system. And so I feel also like, gosh, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. We have all these dollars. We know pre-COVID, the system was not working for our kids in large part. Certainly wasn't working for kids in low-income communities and kids of color. And in my view, this last year has showed us this system is outmoded. It has a very difficult time adapting. And I would say the system doesn't work, but the people do, and that we got to keep that in mind. You know, we know that millions of children have been left out of learning. And I do think just the reminder that our kids are in crisis. There is so much trauma, and we have to center on that. And teachers are experiencing the same thing, right? And we also know there are so many assets in our community. Our kids are full of ideas. They have passions. They have found passions and interests actually over the last year. And what's on my mind is, how do we stoke that? And how do we ensure that we are really focused on meeting kids where they are and our educators where they are? But I do not want us to lose focus on the fact that I've been using this analogy that I see our education system is like a car on a road. And before COVID, this road wasn't working for our kids. It's strewn with shards of glass. There's potholes everywhere. There's all these hazards. Us that are working in the system are trying to figure out, you know, how to find that piece of the road that allows us to accelerate a little bit. COVID hit, the tires imploded on this car that we have. And we all ran to like patch up the tires, figure out how do we get this car moving again. And the truth is the car isn't going to go very fast, because I think it's like us centering on the fact that this car, this road isn't working in a 21st century global economy, society, right? We have to think this system was built over 100 years ago for an industrial revolution. We are now in an information age, and we know that the demands for our kids in the workforce are going to be just fundamentally different. The system wasn't even built assuming women and kids of color would be part of the workforce. And so to me, this is an opportunity for us to say, how do we how do we build a new car? Does this car even need tires? And is this the road? Where's the destination? What's the purpose of education in today's world when we need our kids learning very different set of skills? And what is also true is that this doesn't sound very practical to any educator who's like in it right now, who are like, what are you talking about? Like, we have to get kids engaged. There's all these crises. And so I'm saying all this because I do think we have to keep the big picture in mind, which is like, we have to be pivoting to the future of education and not just try to go back to what was, because that was not working. And the question is, how do we bring our educators along with deep empathy? I mean, our folks, everything that, you know, Jesse and Heather said are just themselves have suffered so much. And so we got to provide the social, emotional like supports for teachers and for students. And the solutions, so many solutions are actually with our educators, they're with our students. And so rather than us, you know, these grandiose ideas, like, I just think there's so much energy if we could just really listen to where people are, what they need, bring in data and science to help us make decisions. I just think we could find acceleration points. But it all begins with, I think, deep empathy, compassion, and realizing we're all on one team. And it's going to take all of us to lean in to be able to get to the other side.
Thanks so much for that, Elisa. And I'd love to build on two thoughts. I'd love to build on two thoughts. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. I'd love to build on two thoughts. The first is, Heather mentioned staying the course, which I think is just incredibly great guidance for philanthropy. And Elisa mentioned defining the moment and really listening and thinking about acceleration points. And I want to turn the conversation more explicitly to race and equity, which I do think staying the course and leveraging this moment in time becomes really important. All of your organizations, as each of you were talking, has a clear commitment to equity. My question for you is, what does a sustained commitment to equity look like beyond the moment we're in? There's been a ton of energy in the wake of Floyd, but what does it look like to sustain this commitment from your vantage point? And I'll open it up to see who'd like to go first.
I'm happy to start if that's okay. You know, at Teach for America, we've clearly defined a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, and it did so probably very clearly back in 2007. And we set out to, we were asking ourselves, because we're predominantly teaching in low-income communities that are predominantly, children of color that we teach, we were asking, how do we diversify our own workforce? And that has to be not an afterthought, but just integral to how we approach the work. And so we set out to do that. And, I shared a bit about the stats of where we are today, which we're really proud of. We also focused on some of our systems, ensuring we had equity of pay internally and did the sort of things that would, the sort of what we call, or what we've learned to call DEI traditional metrics that, are obvious that you should be tracking to ensure that you are living into your commitment. I think what this moment in time has taught us at Teach for America is that while that is really important, it's not pursuing racial equity. And that requires a different body of work that is more cultural. It's really getting on the underbelly of the system to ensure that there's a real sense of belonging and inclusiveness and equity in all the work that we are doing, and doing that in the classroom, beginning with how we train our teachers, how we're supporting our teachers to ensure that we are seeing that lens. And, we've come to understand that, racial equity and educational equity are two sides of the same coin. And we've got to ensure that we are pursuing the work very clearly through a racial equity lens. And so we're in the process of looking at our systems, our culture, our training and support of our teachers and our support of our alumni to ensure that we're able to do that. It begins with getting just really clear on even what's the definition of racial equity? What do we mean by that? What is our definition of racism and how do you think about that? And we're thinking a lot about it from a systemic viewpoint and ensuring that we are able to build our own capabilities and pursuing this. And this is just, as we all know, a long journey that will never end, but ensuring that we have the data and the learning that's allowing us to improve our practice. I believe that's the only responsible path forward as we look at what our kids are facing and what they need from us in the space of education to do the best work that we can and have the greatest impact.
Thank you, Elisa. Heather or Jesse?
Okay. The biggest thing that came to mind when I heard your question about sustaining is the notion, I think what happened that you're saying could be sustained is that a lot of voices got elevated that were not elevated before. So when I think about the answer of sustaining that energy around racial justice, it's keeping those voices elevated. And I think we keep those voices elevated in three big ways. And Elisa definitely spoke to some of these. One would be the listening and the platforms, right? Just the very practical ways in which voices get elevated, making space and being very intentional. I think one of the biggest pieces of the work we do at Alder that has been really powerful for us in terms of all of the work we've done around racial equity is this deep commitment to partnership. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but very much a community-based partnership, sharing tuition with the K-12 school systems where we work. Elisa spoke a lot about the intentionality as well in those partnerships. So I think it's the listening, I think it's the intentionality around partnerships, and then also certainly the data, holding ourselves accountable to who are we bringing in, whose voices are we elevating, how do we know from anything from teachers who get promoted, tracking who becomes principals, who stays, all of the data that really holds us. And then I saw there's a great question in the chat that if we get to.
Do you want to?
Thanks.
Go ahead. Thank you for the question. Couple thoughts. One I think is true in our organization, our schools, and with our teachers and our boards and all that is, it's just a question of like, what should white people do? And I think we saw a couple waves, right? We saw a lot of statements and we saw a lot of emails and websites and stuff. And then I think, and then I'm not sure that a lot of white people, even white people who wanted to do the right thing, knew what to do next. And so I think a lot of us are kind of trying to figure that out. And that sounds really, maybe I sound really stupid saying this, but like, I think that's a really live, important question for white people to struggle with, which is if you are actually trying to do something that's anti-racist, what are those actions, and when do you shut up and when do you step forward, and what's the right balance, and how do you know you're going to screw up a lot, and how can you be open to that? This is not a great example, but I posted a job the other day, and I posted it without a salary, and a friend of mine who's African-American, she messaged me and was like, I'm not going to share this. And she's like, I love you, I want to see you guys, but I'm not going to share this because it's without a salary, and that's inequitable. So like, I wasn't thinking, that obviously wasn't my intent, but there's there's 1,000 things like that a day that I do. And so there are times when I should shut up and listen. There are times when I should be, seeking feedback. I think I'm saying that personally, but I think we need to build that in organizationally. I guess the other thing that I'd think about is, how do we get at the right outcomes? And I don't know what the right outcome is to go for, to be anti-racist. I tend to think focusing on racial wealth gaps might be part of the answer. And so we're trying to think about that a lot more in terms of our partnerships, our work, our schools, in the spirit of like, really separating intent from impact, right? Because like, at the end of the day, intent has not dismantled systemic racism. So like, I don't really care, people can have terrible intent, great intent. I think we need to figure out what we mean by impact, and then get really smart and really cutthroat about measuring it. And quite frankly, like a lot of what we've measured in education has kind of been a proxy for the stuff we care about, right? And so it's like, yeah, that place has great test scores, but what did that translate? And we got to measure the stuff we care about. So.
Yeah, Jesse, thanks so much for that. Really appreciate just your candor around race and the dynamics of allyship and people of color. I think we're getting better and better at having that conversation. So just deeply appreciative of that, and would love to build on something you said around outcomes and move it towards this conversation of diversifying the teacher workforce. What kind of outcomes are we talking about, or should we be talking about? And what might we be looking at for the next stage of this work? And Heather, if it's okay with you, I'd love to start with you. And if others want to respond, great. If not, we can move on. But Heather, would love your thoughts.
Yeah, I love the focus on outcomes as well versus intentionality. And I think, Melinda, the question is if you mean more than, I feel like my answer is very technical. It's what should we measure in terms of outcomes? So I'm going to answer that. And I think there's a number of things we hold ourselves accountable to. And I in a perfect world, so would other organizations trying to do this work. So obviously who we bring in, and that we start with even at the application level. So to Jesse's point, who applies, and then of the number of who applies, if you are looking at that demographically, who gets through, hold yourselves accountable to the who gets through piece. And this is all on the incoming students. We do very similar work on the team. On the team level, it's even more discrete, maybe because it's a smaller team, but the idea of who applies, who gets hired at what level. So an annual accounting of who's on the team, who stayed, who's at which salary bands, who got promoted, all of this cut demographically. So I think outcomes as on who you are as a team and the culture you're creating as an organization. Then there's, and then of course surveys. There's a long list, I think, on that organizational culture, but that's pretty foundational, I think, to the work you are ultimately set up to do. All of the diversity, equity, inclusion work that happens on the organizational level that then sets you up to be successful at who are the incoming students and how well are they doing. So on the incoming students, certainly who's coming in, who makes it through. Completion rates are huge. A lot of people accept a lot of people of color, but they don't make it through. Who gets hired, who actually gets jobs, I think is another huge metric that needs to be tracked. And those retention data that I said, and really tracking the retention of the people, really thinking about, well, what do you mean? What is success? And I'm sure there would be lots of good ways to define that, but tracking success for your alums, efficacy, we determine how successful were we in setting these people up for success so that in their first year out of our system, there's a question, but I can't read it fast enough. And what else are we tracking on residents? Oh, effect on K-12 student learning. So both the two big effects we try to track in terms of our alum efficacy. One is how do principals feel about them as new teachers? And the second is how well are they showing up for students? And that there's a few different metrics we're looking at there. I may be a bit, but yeah, okay.
No, thanks, Heather. And I noted Robert's question in the chat. We'll make sure to come back to that. It's a great question. I wanted to pause here for a moment, because often when we talk about diversifying the workforce, I think immediately people think about racial and ethnic diversity, but there's a wide continuum of what diversity could mean, including geographic. So would love, Elisa, I might turn to you on this. Any thoughts on how we think about educator diversity as related to rural communities? And Jesse, would please feel free to jump in as well. But Elisa, just given the expansive work you've done at Teach for America, I thought you might have thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, currently, just for context, we serve about just over 12% of our core is in rural communities. And a lot of people, and our focus has been there for, the last 30 years. And so, there's lots of similar problems across the country, urban and rural. Obviously, what we see in our rural communities over time, and it's also helping us think about our own contribution and how to think about our impact to the earlier question, is really thinking about, we've been around for over 30 years, we bring teachers in for 2 years, what's actually be the sustainable, change. And we know that in rural communities, the need for teachers is just greater. The shortages are greater across the board. Certainly in STEM, you see acuteness and, special ed, et cetera. But just across the board, it's like, we just need more teachers. And so we've been thinking a lot about and doing various pilots on how to think about really the sustainability of the work there, growing your own, really figuring out how to do the capability and capacity building from within. A lot of kids, they want to stay home. They just need economic opportunities. And so there are just various potential pathways to invest in to ensure that we're doubling down in our rural communities. And we have some of our TFA alums who have tried various things to grow your own and working with other partners to do just that. One thing I wanted to say, Melinda, to the earlier question is we've been focused, we've been around for over 30 years and we just went through a strategy process right before COVID. And, we had been reflecting on the whole world has changed since TFA was founded 31 years ago. And we are bringing in incredible people into the field. But what is changing in communities? And now we really have scale in various communities. And we started to ask ourselves that question. And the reflection was we have these vanity metrics that we track. How big are we, alums in various roles, et cetera, which are very important. But we wanted real accountability. After 30 years, you should have what are real impact goals that you are working alongside many others, because no one org can, create the kind of systems change that we all want. And so we've set a big 10-year goal alongside input from students, families, many others in our community. That is by 2030, twice as many children in communities where we work will reach key educational milestones, indicating they are on a path to economic mobility and co-creating a future filled with possibility. And what it calls on is focus on academics, because we know there are certain milestones in our kids' academic lives that just matter. 4th grade reading and math, 8th grade math, certain career and college readiness indicators. We know that's so important. And we know that's an incomplete picture. So the need to focus on social emotional learning and other broader outcomes is so essential as we go forward. And so we're holding ourselves accountable to defining what community we work with, really putting our partnership and all of our assets to work to support and ensure that there's true systems change rooted in student outcomes. So that in 10 years, we're able to say, we saw a defining growth in communities. And the way we set this was by studying systems, the kind of impact we've seen over the last decade. And, a handful of systems have had this kind of progress. But I think it's time in our feel that we start to think about how do we break down the silos. We're program rich, systems poor to really be able to do big things together for kids. And COVID has only affirmed how important this is for us to stay the course. And it's changing how we operate because it requires, as Heather, you were saying, just deep partnership and powerful partnerships with many others to be able to see the kind of growth that I think we must demand of ourselves in the next decade of this work.
Thank you for that, Elisa. I was noting the chat and I wanted to lift Robert's question, his first question, which is, do you work with recipient, in parentheses, hiring LEAs to assess or strengthen their supportive climate for retention of educators of color? And I'll just read that one more time for the group. Do you work with recipient LEAs to strengthen their supportive climate for retention of educators of color? Jesse, is it okay if I start with you there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're lucky in that, we have one district, so we don't have the complexity that you'll hear from the other panelists. But yeah, I mean, we work very closely with the district, both on targeting, right? So as the district can think about what its talent needs will be a couple of years out, that can inform who we recruit for on the teacher prep end. We have, an induction program that supports folks for 3 years. We've worked with the district to create its own induction program to support all new teachers, and we collaborate pretty closely on what that support looks like. It's also like it's one city, so at this point we know most of the people and most of the principals, so that sort of greases the wheels of systems that are sometimes clunky. That said, a first-year teacher's job is still crazy. We've still have, as much as we've all talked about, we've not fixed the issue that a first-year teacher has the exact same job as a 30th year teacher, and we have done nothing about that. In fact, we usually give the first-year teacher the harder job. So I would say we've, with limited success have we collaborated because we haven't changed that big thing, which I think would need to be changed to really make a difference.
Thanks, Jesse. I wanted to lift another question in the chat because I see that they're coming more quickly now. To any or all of the panelists with the Grow Your Own approach, have you explored creating residency models that include work experience and youth programs as part of a formal teacher pathway and an opportunity to recruit diverse candidates? There's some exciting work in California to build after-school work experience into teacher residencies. It's a terrific way to recruit from the community and create career pathways for youth workers who have so many skills working with young people. And that's from Rebecca. Heather or Elisa, would either of you like to respond to that question?
Yes, I'm not positive, but if this is thinking about the linked learning work and some of the CTE work that's happening in California, we've been looking and trying to build partnerships there. If Rebecca, you want to reach out, I'd love to talk. We reached out a couple of years ago because we agree with your sentiment that there does seem to be such an obvious pipeline there and opportunity for connection. So certainly something I'm curious about, and certainly see the same opportunity. Outside linked learning, great. I'll hope that they put our emails in the chat or something. I would love to connect.
Linda, one opportunity that I'll see doesn't respond directly to residency models, but as COVID hit, we saw in 2 of our communities, one in Phoenix and then in Washington, our leaders of those communities, we have a lot of alumni in those communities, went out and asked alums, what do you most need right now? And the response was, we just need more hands on deck. We need more adults tutoring, helping our kids, which we know everyone's having the tutoring conversation. But I mention it because we went for it, given the infrastructure we have on college campuses. And so in Arizona, really focused on, University of Arizona and ASU to get kids to say, is anyone interested in tutoring within Arizona, and it was online because of COVID, but we had a lot of interest from those schools. A lot of those kids grew up in Arizona, who said, hey, I'd help out. They were getting paid. It was part of the school day. It was high dosage tutoring, essentially, that we were able to set up this program right away. And the results were really incredible. We focused on 3rd grade literacy, we focused on middle school math. And what we saw was, of course, we're looking to see if we can attract folks to apply for Teach for America. but we were able to attract a range of folks, and it was interesting to see that folks were able to get real experience. And we have seen over time that helps just pique people's interest and want to learn more when they're able to get their hands dirty, have that kind of experience, to even just consider education as a next step. And so we'll see what we learn. We're expanding the pilot to 7 other communities. But I think there's just lots of opportunity to get folks involved earlier, and we're seeing, getting folks involved earlier and earlier is more important as they consider education or their careers, because they're making decisions earlier and earlier in their life. And so I think there's just lots of innovative ways that we can think about how to get people into the workforce and considering education as a step out of college.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elisa. As I'm listening to you all, I'm thinking about the role of philanthropy in all of this. And I know that, sometimes the flow of money can be unfocused. Sometimes that's good, and sometimes complicated. How can philanthropy be helpful with this? I'll leave it broad, but I'll pause there. How can philanthropy be helpful?
This is easy for me to say because I'm not on that side of the table, but I think the thing that's in all of our minds right now is I think it's $118 billion at the federal level. Just for comparison, Race to the Top was $4.5 billion, and think of what a big deal that was. Massachusetts was one of the states that won. We won $250 million. The city of Boston will get over $400 million by itself without competing. So, and you'll forgive me because I'm going to set this up and then I have no idea how to answer it. But I think an interesting question for philanthropy is, could you use some money and influence to shape how those dollars are spent, and to think about what we want to get out of it? I'm so worried, as I'm sure we all are on the call, like that money's just going to go to fill in cracks that were already there and not change anything. And so I know from the philanthropic side, we're probably not going to have 118 billion in addition, but there may be some kind of matching or some kind of leverage that philanthropy has. And hopefully maybe someone else on the call has a smarter way about how to bring that home, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
I mean, I'll add to that, Jesse, to the point of just so many dollars and it being very open. I do think there's ways for folks to just be in deep partnership with people making decisions and just starting to offer that as a partnership. So as an example, to push on data-driven decisions, I just think it's one of the most important things that we could be doing, because we're about to spend a lot of money, and on the back end of it in 2 to 3 years, if we do not see real progress, it's very discouraging to ask people to continue to invest, especially in philanthropy. When we have access to so many dollars, let's make use of them. So just as an example, 20% of funds that district get have to be spent addressing learning loss of sorts. And so folks have to, there's a range of considerations folks will have. They'll ask themselves, okay, should I get smaller classroom sizes? Should I extend my school day or school year? Should I have high dosage tutors, et cetera? There's all these considerations. And we're really encouraging our systems leaders to look at equivalencies to understand the trade-offs. And we know a lot about this, right? Like these are not new ideas. They have been tested. They have been played around with for many years. And so if you take $1,000 per pupil as an example, and you choose to reduce class sizes, you're reducing by 2 kids. And we know that in order for class sizes to actually have an impact, you need class sizes of 12 to 15. So if you're going to go all in, then just know the data that says, let's make sure classroom sizes are 12 to 15, per class for the next 2 to 3 years, because that's what's required for us to be responsive to the moment. But that you're clear-eyed about it, right? We know high dosage tutoring is actually really effective if it's done with certain parameters in mind. And you could spend $1,000 per pupil and do high dosage tutoring for 1/3 of kids in a school. And what do you get for that, et cetera. We could go down the list. And so I just think the push to just get really clear and data driven on the trade-offs of how to spend money is really important for all of us to be doing as we are engaging with our systems. And the second thing that's related to that is obviously just having information. There's all this, toxic conversation about assessment at the moment, and not wanting to do assessment given the kind of year we had. And my only interest is like, we need information, because we cannot smartly intervene unless we have information of where kids are. And folks are making various cases of what the data means or represents, but we do know that racism thrives when there is no data. So we need data, and we need to be committed to ensuring that we get better measures of learning. And that has to be the commitment. Like the measures are incomplete, are flawed, but no data does not work. And we have to ensure that we're just committed to evolving that. So those are the big things on my mind. The last thing I'll do is a push for the need for certain infrastructure, investments that are one-time investments that just help us, get foundational for all kids. Things like, we've been talking about the digital divide for decades. And, people, I don't know, like that has not been solved yet. This whole year, 15 to 16 million kids had no access to learning because they had no devices, no connectivity. That's unacceptable. Devices and connectivity are like backpacks, paper, and pencil of the past. And so we have to make sure every kid has that, given the requirements and the skills that they need to develop over time. We have HVAC, like some schools we were just talking about earlier, the school's getting canceled because there's no air conditioning and it's so hot. I was talking to a core member in the Mississippi Delta where like they don't have proper ventilation. A lot of their kids have asthma. They don't have air conditioning. They were letting school out early or canceling school altogether because there's no AC in some of these buildings. That is unacceptable. And we have to fix the ceilings, the plumbing, all the things that we know are true in inner city and rural schools. And so I just think the need for investment in certain infrastructure that provide just the basic conditions for kids to be able to learn are essential.
Thank you so much, Elisa. There are so many good points that just came out in the last 90 seconds. So I just want to highlight them so they're not lost. One, Jesse, you made the great point of 118 billion at the federal level. We could just literally sit with that and have a separate panel. But in the interest of time, the second, the push to be data-driven, I think is so timely and right. Also, this idea of being in deep partnership with leaders to develop a learning agenda of sorts or make sure we're tracking in the right direction, I think is spot on. And lastly, Elisa, your point around one-time investments and how we can think more strategically about what investments look like, all incredibly helpful thoughts. As we're nearing the end of time, and I'm looking at the chat, I'll end with a question from the chat. I see lots of them, so I'm sort of closing my eyes and picking. And it's a little long, but I'm going to read it because some cool words are popping out at me. I ran the Colorado residency program, and even then we wondered, to the extent that human-centered deeper learning is more about facilitating learning than content delivery, do we need to rethink our emphasis on four-year degrees and master's degrees, which have been barriers to entry for individuals from diverse backgrounds? Programs like Big Picture Learning and other alternative programs that have historically done a better job serving diverse student populations recruit with better lens. So I think the key question is, do we need to rethink our emphasis on four-year degrees and master's degrees, which have been barriers to entry? And we will end there before we close out and give each of you a few seconds just to share any remaining ideas. So this will be our lightning round. A minute on this question if anyone has thoughts. Heather, I'm only going to you because you were nodding as I was asking. So
yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm a huge fan of the work at Big Picture. They're very much learning by doing, which of course is the idea of a residency model. Anyway, to the question, I'm not positive that I think that the actual obstacle is the master's or the BA. I think BA and master's done well are actually really critical to the work that we want teachers to do. And we've been remarkably successful at bringing people in. The biggest obstacle in most states is a teacher test that most grad schools and or a lot of programs require teachers to take before they even get into the program. And so one of the barriers that I know people have flagged is that we don't make it a requirement to be in the program. Ultimately, we help them pass the test while they're with us. And our pass rates are really, really high, as you saw through completion and hiring rates. So I'm probably, I'm not, yeah, that's my answer. I believe in the BA and MA done well, and I think that there are other obstacles that are more concerning.
Appreciate that, Heather, and you got an amen in the chat. I think what we'll do now is shift. I'd love to give each of our panelists, let's just say around 45 seconds each to share a closing thought before we turn it over to Celine to close us out. And just want to say thank you so much. I learned a ton today and I'm deeply appreciative. And Elisa, will turn it to you, and then Jessie, and then Heather. 45-second closing thought, and then back to Celine. Thank you so much.
I think my 45-second thought is, as we all learn to stand powerfully in the face of uncertainty, which is what I think we can expect as we go forward, what's most on my mind is how do we work in deep partnership with each other? This is a time where we need all hands on deck. We all have a critical role to play. And how do we center equity, student voice in the decisions that we are making, lock arms, and just refuse for this to be a generation lost, a generation that defines this as a turning point for not the positive for our country. This is actually an opportunity we can come together and make a different choice. And that choice is up to us to put out there the possibility of it, work with others to be able to create that. And so that's what's most on my mind. And it's an honor to be in partnership with all of you who are all committed to the same end.
Well, if you don't mind me just basically dittoing yours, I think that's what I would do. And I'll just say that I have a long history of unpublished letters and pieces that I write, which someday will turn into a great book. So I'm just warning you, that's coming out. And one of them, and this goes to actually a question in the chat, one of them that I wrote a long time ago was TFA is not our enemy, right? And there's such there's so much time that we spend arguing and fighting with the people who are probably closest to us on the continuum, while ignoring, the awful, hateful things happening on both sides. And residencies and TFA have a different approach to teacher preparation, but setting it up as this dichotomy is insane. And so I guess it's helpful that you're from TFA, and so I can say it to your face, but that's the point is exactly what you said, is that our kids don't care what teacher preparation program name you went through. They care about a caring adult, right? Good instruction, all that stuff. And us finding common cause and dropping the other stuff is just so essential. So thank you.
I will build on that. And I noticed one of the first questions that came over from Anonymous was sort of to this point. And so really building on the idea of, we have Elisa, Jessie, and I, and every other teacher prep org in the country has a set of shared problems, a set of shared goals. I think digging in and doubling down on the partnership around those shared problems and shared goals. And then I really do, my biggest thing beyond that partnership is staying the course and recognizing that the problems that everybody who showed up today for this, panelists and audience, every one of us cares about problems that have been with us. You opened, Melinda, I think, by starting with how old the education system is. And so staying the course in that partnership feels like the other really big important part.
Well, thank you all. It is exactly 1 o'clock on the East Coast. So this has just been a fantastic hour. For many of you I saw on the attendee list have been here for all 3 of our sessions on the post-COVID recovery. We had one on budgeting, we had one on curriculum and instruction and assessment, but I could not let a series go without us having one on teachers, because we're not going to improve schools. We're not going to make them anti-racist institutions without really focusing on the teacher piece. And so thank you to all of you on the panel who've been in this work for quite a while for your insights. And thank you to all who joined us. Have a great rest of the day.